Hello and welcome to Abralin ao Vivo, Linguists Online. My name is Luis Miguel Rojas Bersha. I will be moderating Professor Seuren's presentation today. So welcome again to Abralin ao Vivo, Linguists Online, an initiative of Abralin, the Associação Brasileira de Linguística, in collaboration with several international associations, among which the Comité International Permanent des Linguistes, the Asociación de Lingüística y Filología de América Latina, the Sociedad Argentina de Estudios Lingüísticos, the Sociedad Española de Lingüística, the Linguistic Society of America, the Linguistics Association of Great Britain, the Australian Linguistic Society, and the British Association for Applied Linguistics. So who's our guest today? Professor Dr. Pieter Seuren's career started in 1967 when he became a lecturer in linguistics at the University of Cambridge. In 1970, he moved to the University of Oxford, where he also became a lecturer in linguistics. In 1974, he was appointed as Professor of Philosophy of Language at the Radboud University, Nijmegen in the Netherlands. In 1995, he moved over to the Arts Faculty of the same university to become Professor of Theoretical Linguistics. Since 1988, he has been a Fellow at the Royal Dutch Academy of Science, and since 1999, he has been a Research Fellow at the Max Planck Institute for Psycholinguistics. Professor Seuren is one of the founders and advocates of generative semantics, a theory he has been developing ever since. He is known for his major contributions to the theory of syntax, meaning, and the history of linguistics. Some of his major publications include Semantic Syntax, published by Brill in 2018, the volumes Language in Cognition and the Logic of Language, published by Oxford University Press, and most recently, Saussure and Séché, Myth and Genius. All questions can be written down in our chat. Abralin ao Vivo, I will be writing them down and reading them afterwards when the presentation is over. Welcome, Professor Seuren.
Thank you very much, Luis Miguel. So we now start. This lecture is an initiation, or if you like, an appetizer to the theory of semantic syntax, which I've been working at since the early 1970s. And I intend to give you a taste of what real syntax amounts to. And how exciting it can be as the regularities in the sentences of the languages you study pop up and the system unfolds itself. Now, a semantic syntax grammar is an algorithmic system producing the sentences S of a language L from the semantic input. Now, the semantic input, I call the semantic analysis of Peter. How do I move to the next slide? Oh, yes. We have the semantic analysis here. I'm putting the arrow around it. It's abbreviated SA. That is fed into a box. You see the square lines of a box. A cognitive module with multiple feedbacks. It is a production model because modeling the comprehension of sentences is a different thing. The comprehension makes essential use of the production model, but the production model is basic, is fundamental. And to the extent that the comprehension model has to find its way back from the output, the phonetic form here, back to the SA, so that the listener knows what the sentence means. That is largely a question of expectation, discourse-driven, context, situation-driven expectation, hypothesis, and checking through, rapidly checking multiple times, sometimes through the production machine to see if there is a proper match. So we will concentrate for the moment on the production model. That is, semantic syntax is a production model. And the input to the model is the semantic analysis. And the first element of the production plant, so to speak, the first element is called the cycle. It's boxed in, and it has the SA as input, and as output, it has a structure which is called a shallow structure. That's here. That is input immediately to the post cycle. The post cycle produces a structure, a triangle, all structures are triangles, called the surface structure, or SS, which again is input to the morphology and then the phonology of the language. And the ultimate output of the box is, of the grammar box, is phonetic form, a set of instructions to the speaker of how to realize his mental semantic analysis into material sound or writing. The whole thing is boxed in because it is a cognitive module, in the sense that was first presented, the term was also presented in a book by Jerry Fodor of 1983, I believe. And the grammar is a module in the sense that you have no conscious access to it. Speakers, qua speakers, have no idea of what is inside the box. It is, so to speak, for your consciousness, it is a black box. And the task of the linguist is to reconstruct the inside of the box by means of scientific theorizing. And that's what we are doing today. So, the input, as I said, of the grammar box is the SA. The SA has the form of a logical proposition with lexical items inserted already. That is why from cognition, you have to go first to the lexicon, you pick your crucial lexical items, and they tell you how to form your essay, owing to the indications, the instructions that you are given by the lexicon. The lexicon is much more than a word list plus meanings. It also contains structural directions for the building up of the sentence you are going to produce. So SAs, semantic analyses, are not universal. They're already filtered by the lexicon and lexically filled in here, so that there may be profound differences in the surface structures of sentences of different languages, which are due to the way the lexicon has manipulated the lexical items needed for the sentence. What happens in cognition is still largely opaque. We know very little about that, but by working our way upwards through the lexicon back to cognition, we are beginning to have an idea of what cognition actually does. what is certain at this moment, and has been certain for over 50 years, is that the SA has the grammatical structure of a logical formula, which ties up semantic syntax directly with logic. And here is an immediate further problem, because logic has become mathematical over the last 120 years or so. And the logic of the mind is not the same as the logic that is currently practiced in mathematics. So we have to, if we want to develop a theory of semantic syntax, we also have to develop a theory of cognitive logic, how logic works in the mind. I won't talk about that any further today, because that would take up far too much time. But one has to realize that the logic of the mind is very different from the logic of mathematics, mainly because the mind has a knack of restricting the universe of discourse. The logic itself, the actual rules of inference, etc., they can be maintained, but when you restrict the universe in systematic ways, you get a more powerful and richer logical system. This is a direction of research that has been badly neglected by the mathematical logicians over the past century. And this is what we, as linguists, as students of language, have to do when we occupy ourselves with logic. But again, I will not indulge in any further elaboration of that aspect. I'll just look at the grammar, but it needed to be mentioned. So, we will have a look at what the cycle and the post-cycle amount to a little later on. I will say nothing about morphology and phonology. But I will, before I will show you how semantic syntax works for a couple of sentences, one English sentence and a French sentence, we will have to look at the right-hand side here. This is the Chomsky model of grammar. As per, here you can see, as per 1995. And I am basically, fundamentally opposed to that. This model, this Chomskyan model, is thoroughly false and not viable for the study of grammar, even though it is the standard model practiced by theoretical linguists at the moment. That this anomalous situation exists is due entirely and solely to historical circumstances, which will hopefully be undone in the near future. In a Chomsky grammar, you start not with an SA, you start with a button, a push button on a machine, the start symbol. So you push the button and then the machinery starts to work. It makes a random selection of lexical items. That random selection is then tried out for any possible sentence you can form with them, which in itself is a cognitively absurd operation. We don't produce random sentences. We produce sentences when we want to say something that has a meaning in a given context and situation. But that is what the Chomsky grammar proposes. Now, from that random lexical selection, you get into a syntactic generator called merge, which tries to form a well-formed but so far meaningless syntactic structure, which has a mysterious name, sigma. That syntactic structure, which like honey out of a sieve, drips from the syntactic generator, that is then subjected to two so-called interpretive components. On the one hand, here, it is fed into a phonological component, which tells you, which has a phonetic form output and tells you how it is to be pronounced, no matter how silly in the given context or situation. And on the other hand, there is a semantic component which tells you what it means. Even though it is may be totally absurd in any given context or situation. And the specification of what it means is given in a structure called LF, logical form they call it, and that is more or less similar to what I call my semantic analysis. Only similar in that it has a logical structure. This way, the Chomskyans proudly say, we have coupled a meaning to a phonetic form. Thank you very much, but this is not how language works. We will come back to that later, of course, but this is to indoctrinate you to begin with against this Chomskyan model of grammar. The history of that is a rather painful episode in the history of linguistics. We'll also come back to that. Right. Now, to show you how semantic syntax works, I will first take an example sentence. The sentence is, the cat may have eaten the mouse. What is the semantic analysis of that sentence? That's the A structure here on the left, up top. First of all, there is a speech act operator, which says that this is an assertion, like the cat may have eaten the mouse. It's not a question. The question would be, may the cat have eaten the mouse? But that's not our structure here. Just to save time, I will leave the function and the modus operandi of the speech act operator out of account here and look only at the grammatical form of the cat may have eaten the mouse. Then you see that there are two main subcomponents of the structure. The one is called aux for auxiliary component, auxiliary part. And the other one is called lexical matrix. That's this little house-shaped gable here. The matrix contains the crucial lexical elements, and that has to be a predicate, as in logic, a predicate, which is eat here, plus the terms that it requires, the number of terms it requires. It requires a subject term, that's the first NP, the first noun phrase, and it requires an object term, the second NP. The mouse is the one that's being eaten, and the cat is the one that eats. But that's not eat the cat, the mouse is not sufficient. It has to be placed in time. Is it happening now? Did it happen in the past? So first of all, there is a T1 here, a tense one, which is also a predicate, the tense one. And for this sentence, it is the present tense. And then there is a modal, may, the cat may have eaten. I'm not asserting that the cat is eating the mouse, but I'm saying may have eaten. And so not may be eating, but may have eaten. So the actual event precedes, that's the second tense here, the T2, it precedes the first tense. So it is possible now that in the past, the cat ate the mouse. This is sufficient for the sentence at hand. Now, let's have a further look. All the lexical items are predicates. You see, the present tense is a predicate. In the logical sense, the futuricity operator is a modal. We'll come back to that later. Is a modal predicate, but it is a predicate. And then the second tense, the T2, again is a predicate, which is sometimes realized as a verb, like English have, which is a verb, but sometimes it's realized as an affix, as in languages with the morphological pluperfect. I'm not talking now about the, what have I done? Yep. I'm not talking now about the semantic category of NPs, but I do take it that proper names and also, no, I have to go back up again. I'm not used to this, you see. Okay, now, yes. The cat is a predicate, mouse is a predicate at the semantic level, and the makes it a noun phrase for both cat and mouse. And but we won't go into noun phrase grammar right now because we don't have enough time. So, but cat and mouse are also predicates. The X such that X is a cat, and to be a cat is a predicate. Right. Then you see that underneath each predicate, in angled brackets, you have certain codes, SR, L, 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 and nothing here. That's got to do with the cycle, because the cycle is a processing plant which instructs the machine to go through each embedded S, starting at the bottom. So we start at S3, at the lowest S. Why does it start at the lowest S? Because in the end, the last value we want from the whole procedure is the speech act operator and whatever S1 amounts to. But you don't know what S1 amounts to unless you know what predicate plus S modal amounts to, etc., etc. It's like a multiplication table or like an addition table. You have to, like a multiplication table, you have to start in the with the innermost formula, and then when you have that value, you climb up until you come to the top operator, which is plus or minus or divided by, etc. So we start here at S3. No rule is required. But one thing happened. The notion of the label predicate is changed into the label V for verb, because that's what the cycle does. As the grammar passes through as the SA passes through a cycle, then the lexical items assume their surface value. And eat is listed in the lexicon as a verb. So when we pass through the S3 cycle, predicate eat is changed into V eat. That's all that happens. Now we pass through the next cycle up, S2, preceding with the rule lowering. So we must apply the rule lowering and at the same time change the predicate label into the prescribed surface label, which is verb for English. Preceding means before the time indicated by T1, which is not yet processed. So what we get here is, and the form of lowering involved that is prescribed in the lexicon is it is attached to the verb form, and it takes this is the process, left attached. most European languages take left attachment for lowering, except in certain cases in German, which takes, as we will see in a moment, which takes right attachment. So we get this V cluster, we call this a cluster, have, eat. Now we have finished the S2 cycle and we go to the modal cycle here. And the modal cycle, again, does the same. It assigns a surface label, which again is V because modalities are verbs in English, may, and the lowering is the same. And what happens here is the instruction, the lowering, and what we get is may, have, eat. The same process we had here, but repeated now. V is attached to the V cluster have, eat. Now we have finished the S2 cycle, or this cycle, and we go to the S1 cycle. Now there are two rules that have to be applied. The first one is lowering. So present is lowered onto the V cluster according to the instructions of the lexicon. And the lexicon says that the relabeling present in English is not a verb. It is an affix. So here we have the may cluster. Now we have the lowering. And present is categorized as an affix. You can see that here, affix present, and you get this V cluster there. Then the second rule, oh, I'm going too quickly. I'm sorry for that. I go back. First, second, subject raising, SR. Subject raising takes the subject of the embedded S, puts it in the place of its own S, and that S moves to the right, the immediate right of the raised element, the raised NP. Subject raising only applies when there is an NP in the lower subject, in the lower sentence. So, and then since this S has been robbed of its subject, it is automatically relabeled /S. /S is what is traditionally called the verb phrase, the VP. It means if you give it a subject, it becomes an S. So the slash means lacks a subject. And the cat stands here. The cat, and then may have eaten the mouse. Now there is a last rule. Present must be lowered. It has, as I said before, the surface category affix, and it becomes part of the V cluster. Now we have finished the cycle. Apart, of course, from the speech act operator. And we have this structure. And this is the shallow structure. The shallow structure will be input to the post cycle. But you already recognize the surface sentence. The cat present may have eat the mouse. It's a sort of half-finished product. And the finishing touch is given by the post cycle, which will eventually produce the cat may have eaten the mouse. The affix present is then attached to may plus present remains may plus past is might, but for the moment we concentrate on the cycle. How are we going to do that? May have Peter, do I have to just push down to get to the next? Yes. Okay. Now we are going to have a look at the French sentence. The French sentence is, and if I move it down, figure 3, yes. The French sentence is Anne fera voir la lettre à Didier. It's a more complicated sentence than the one we saw before. But the procedure is the same. So this here is the input structure, the essay, with all the rule features and all the semantic elements. It's an assertion, but we forget about that. It is in the present time, but projected onto the future. The future is a modal predicate. Then we have the, not the preceding, but the simultaneous tense too. Fera, voir, not with preceding, it would be aura fait voir la lettre. But this is not our sentence. Our sentence is fera voir. So it's the present time, the present tense of the future. And then here we have the matrix element. The main predicate is faire, a subject an, and the object term in this case is an embedded S. That is what the essay structure allows for. It allows for embedded S's for the subject and the object terms, never for the indirect object. There is no language in the world, that's a language universal. There's no language in the world which has an S structure for indirect object, only for subjects and direct objects. In this case, it's a direct object. And the direct object is voir Didier la lettre, see Didier the letter. And that's what the sentence means. It means Anne will make sure that Didier sees the letter. That's what the sentence means. Now, how is this processed by the cycle? Oh, here we go again. How is this processed by the cycle? We start at the lowest cycle. No rule applies, no cyclic rule applies, because voir has no rule feature attached to it. The only thing that happens is that predicate here, voir, is replaced with v. Voir is a verb, and it will go through life as a verb from now on. Then we pass on to the S3 cycle. There is a rule feature, predicate raising. What does predicate raising do? Very simple. It takes the lower verb. This is no longer a predicate, it's a verb. It takes the lower verb, cuts it off the tree, and attracts it, attaches it to itself. And faire, in the meantime, at the same time, is also relabeled V. So we get the little V cluster. And the S node here, where are we? The S4 node, and that's a general principle of the grammar. When an S4 node loses its predicate, it disappears. It's no longer an S. As we have seen, when it loses its subject term, it becomes a /S. But when it loses its predicate, the node is eliminated, and all remaining material, NP Didier and NP Lalette, is reattached higher up. And that's what you see here. Here you have the verb cluster, faire voir, and you have 3 NPs. Anne plus Didier la lettre, which have been reattached higher up in that order. So now we have 3 terms, 3 NP terms. And the theory says that if that is so, then the first one is the subject, the middle one is the indirect object, which becomes a dative, and that is, the last one is the direct object. And of course, in the Germanic languages, you have this order in the surface. Anne showed Didier the letter, but you can also have and showed the letter to Didier. And that process is obligatory in French. It's called dative extraposition, but the underlying form is this. And then you see why Didier is the indirect object or the dative in French. And this can only be done with lexicalized NPs, not with NPs that have the form of an embedded S. So we now have faire voir and Didier Lalette. We go up to the next cycle. Sim is to be lowered onto the V cluster. That's what happens here. The realization of sim is 0. The lexical status is V, and that's it. Then we go up to the modal cycle here. You see, future is lowered onto the verbal cluster. But in French, futuricity is not a verb as it is in English or Dutch or German. It's an affix. But that makes no difference for the meaning, and it's still a modal. It's not a tense, it's still a modal. We'll talk about that in a moment. And so now we have a V cluster with an affix. And now we have the so-called tense routine. Go back here. 2 rules. First, subject raising, like we saw in the English sentence. And comes here, we have a /s, a VP. And this is already, it's like a fetus in the womb. You see, it's developing. And future 0, faire voir Didier Lalettre. But we still have to lower the present operator. So an affix is, present is an affix. Present, future, 0, faire voir Didier Lalettre. Again, it's already looking like a surface structure, but not quite yet. It still has to go to a different oven and bake there for a few more minutes. And then in the end, you get the sentence, Anne fera voir la lettre à Didier. We'll see in a moment a little bit more about the post-cyclic process. First, I want to show you this. Yes. Typically, when in the underlying structure, in the essay, there is no direct object, but only a subject, like Anne fera partir Didier, Anne will make Didier leave, then in the after predicate raising, you only have 2 terms here, you see? And then automatically Anne is the subject and the second term is the direct object. Because if there are only 2 terms, the first is the subject and the second is the direct object. And indeed, if you want to say that Anne made Didier leave, then you don't get a dative in French, you get an object, Anne fera partir Didier. And that is an automatic, free of charge bonus of the system. You don't need a separate explanation of the dative. It follows automatically from the system. And if there is no subject in the embedded clause embedded under the causative verb, you don't get a dative, you get a subject and an object. Now, this is what you see in other languages also. Look at Turkish, for example. Turkish has predicate raising. And look at this sentence. Mektubu imzaladım. I signed the letter. Turkish is a VSO language. It has verb first, followed by subject, followed by object. the letter accusative with the u suffix for the accusative, and sein, oh yeah, here, sein imzala with the past suffix d and for the first singular I. I signed the letter. But now I made the director sign the letter. Müdüre mektubu imzalattım. Müdüre is the dative. I caused, sign, I, the director, the letter. The middle term is director, so it becomes a dative. And you have now, in semantic syntax, you have no problem with that anymore. The dative is an automatic consequence of the machinery. Mektubu is the, u is the accusative suffix for mektub, the letter, and imzalatim is the verb form. If you have I made the letter be signed without a director, then you just have mektubu without müdüre. Or if I made the director leave, then müdür becomes an accusative, which in this case is müdüra. Müdür. This is the accusative müdüri. Müdüri imzalatim. I made it müdüri. I made him go geltim. But then you get the accusative here. Nor is it the case that in all languages the embedded subject becomes a dative. In German, in particular, it becomes an accusative. This has historical reasons because the predicate raising construction was not recognized by 16th century German grammarians who only knew Latin grammar, and Latin does not have predicate raising, it has subject raising in complementation systems. And in subject raising, the embedded subject becomes an accusative. So and this was then pushed down the throat of all little children at school, and they learned the accusative, although there is a clear trend in present day spoken German to give it the dative also. You see, nature is stronger than nurture. But in official German, you say, dass Johann den Schüler, the pupil, in accusative, den Ball zu werfen gelehrt hat. Yeah? Now, Dutch, like German, has predicate raising throughout its complementation system. It has no subject raising. Grammarians, especially Chomsky grammarians, have always thought that embedded object sentences take subject raising, but that's not true. They all take predicate raising, with the result that in complex questions, you can have a series of up to 4 NPs in a row, followed by 4 corresponding verb forms. And that's strange, the short-term working memory of the receiver, of the person at the receiving end. So a clause like dat Jan het kind, de hond, de bal wilde laten leren halen stretches the working memory. It's difficult to process, but fortunately in Dutch, many of those cases of predicate raising are optional. So you can make it easier and you can say dat Jan het kind, de hond, wilde laten leren de bal te halen. Of dat Jan het kind wilde leren de hond de bal te laten halen, which is easier to process. But this sentence, the B sentence, is still grammatical, although it strains the listener's capacity to comprehend. I will insert now a little bit about the history of semantic syntax. Semantic syntax was an offshoot of Chomskyan grammar. In the late 1960s. It was a movement initiated by the linguist Paul Postel and the philosopher Gerald Katz. And they published a book in 1964 called An Integrated Theory of Linguistic Descriptions, where they showed that the grammar model as developed by Chomsky up till that time is significantly simplified and improved when you assume that the underlying input structure, which at the time was called the deep structure, is in fact a semantic representation. It simplifies the grammar, and that was brought out very clearly when 1 year later Chomsky published his book Aspects of the Theory of Syntax, where he uses his own existing model and where you can clearly see that it doesn't work for a lot of cases where the Katz-Postel 1964 system has an answer. Unfortunately, at that moment, Chomsky was either unwilling or incapable of adapting his own position, his own theory, and incorporating the new approach. He did so for a very short while, but then after 1965, he reverted to his original position. And that has been the origin of what is now known as the linguistic wars that raged from 1967 till the mid-1970s. And we were on the losing side. Jim Macaulay, who died in 1999, and his associates, I was one of them, we lost that war because we didn't have a command of publicity and media techniques, which the Chomskyans were very good at. Anyway, so I'm taking up that war again now. And the argument is still the same. The argument is that semantic syntax is empirically far superior to the Chomsky grammar model, even in its present form. Underlying the whole debate, I don't want to call it a war anymore, but underlying the whole debate is the notion that if the foundation of your theory is brittle, then sooner or later you'll have to pay for that and it will give in. At that moment, at that critical moment, you have to replace your theory with a better one. And my claim is that semantic syntax is a better theory. And underlying that claim is the fact that the Chomsky model, the model, I'll show it again to you here. The Chomsky model here, this one, is based on a semantic interpretation model developed by neo-positivists, in particular by Rudolf Carnap during the 1930s. And Chomsky has followed that model. You push a button, out comes a linguistic structure according to, in the eyes of Carnap, very simple linguistic rules, which are totally unrealistic as a grammar of language. And that structure is subjected to a semantic component, which took the form of model theoretic semantics, the way that Montague has tried to apply it to natural language unsuccessfully. And then you have an artificially produced random sentence with a meaning attached to it. This was the neo-positivist Carnap model of grammar, and that was taken over lock, stock, and barrel by Chomsky, and he sticks to it to this day. Chomsky is therefore essentially a neo-positivist, and he has never changed. he posed as a cognitivist during the 1950s and the early 1960s when he was at Harvard and part of the new revolutionary group of angry psychologists headed by Miller and Bruner, who rejected neopositivism and insisted upon the causal role of the mind, the human mind, in the theory of human behavior, including linguistic behavior. And Chomsky immediately joined that movement, but he was a fifth column member, really, because what Chomsky opposed was not neopositivism, it was behaviorism, not neopositivism, and he never was a wholehearted member of that group. And that has become very clear now. At the moment, the Chomsky model of grammar is in troubled water because it fails to connect. At the moment, it is very clear that it fails to connect with adjacent disciplines like psycholinguistics, neurolinguistics, sociolinguistics, historical linguistics, applied linguistics, the lot. They form an isolated body of scholars who do not communicate with the others. When you go to a linguistics department nowadays, you get, as a student, you get a number of courses that have nothing to do with each other. And students of linguistics nowadays are puzzled by that. They don't understand what language amounts to because they hear one thing in one course and a totally different thing in another course. That's a bad sign. Linguistics is crumbling. And in order to reunify the whole thing, I say you need to reshape the whole theory of grammar according, in principle, to the notions of semantic syntax. That will help you out and reject the neo-positivist model, which is caught between absurdity on the one hand, because as a realist model of language, it is absurd. We are not random sentence producers. And on the other hand, it's caught between that and, on the other hand, a totally unnecessary, complex, formal set of rules that do not do the job they were intended for. And if they do it very artificially and in far too convoluted a manner. So Chomskyan grammar is caught between, as I put it in my 2004 book, it's caught between absurdity as a realist theory and perversity as a formalist Carnapian theory. And it thus falls between two chairs and ends up on the floor. My answer is follow semantic syntax and you will see an avenue. Okay, I resume my talk now and go and continue with the predicate raising story that I had interrupted. So further confirmation of the predicate raising analysis for the French faire construction, you see in the behavior of clitic pronouns. And now we enter the post cycle. In French, and all students of French, all pupils, everyone who learns French has to learn a rule that tells him that this is so. When you replace the noun phrases, the letter and Didier by anaphoric pronouns, they get prefixed to the verb form. And you get Anne la lui fera voir. Anne will make him see it. Him is Didier, it is the letter. And you cannot say in French, Anne le fera la voir. Impossible. But if you, instead of faire, you have veut, want, and wants to give it to him, then you have to say Anne veut la lui donner. And you cannot say Anne la lui veut donner. That's ungrammatical in modern French. But it was fully grammatical 300 or 400 years ago. Then you could say, and you find that in the literature all over the place, you could say either Anne la lui veut donner or Anne veut la lui donner. Now, the Chomskyans had noted that, and they invented a totally ad hoc rule, namely clitic raising, which has no foundation in theory. It's purely ad hoc, just to accommodate the fact that it doesn't even do that. We now see that this is an automatic consequence of the grammar, because the rule, the post-cyclic rule, the post-cyclic rule clitic movement says that pronominal objects, direct and indirect, are prefixed to the VP, to the /s of the sentence, are prefixed to the V cluster. So what happens is that the lui and the la, which are outside the V cluster, through the clitic movement rules now come, they are attached to the V cluster. And this is what you see here. Meanwhile, the verb cluster, the subcluster, the verbal subcluster heading a tempus affix, a tense affix at present, is relabeled post-cyclically finite verb form. Okay. And then post-cyclically, these clitic pronouns are incorporated into the verb form in a special clitic likewise. And you get Anne la lui fera voir. And there is no way for lui and la to enter the verb cluster in their own way. They have to be prefixed as that. But now in Anne veut la lui donner, and wants to give it to him, you have two SS's, because vouloir in French does not command, does not induce predicate raising. It only induces subject deletion. That is, if the subject of the embedded clause equals, referentially equals the lower subject is deleted, and automatically, because the embedded S loses its subject term, automatically the embedded S is demoted to /s or VP. So there you have two SS's, a main two /s's, a main /s and an embedded /s. And now the same rule applies. The clitics are attached to the immediately commanding /s, and you get Anne veut la lui donner. And how come 17th century French? That is because in 17th century, the rule in 17th century French, the rule of predicate raising was optional. You could apply it or you could not apply it. If you applied it, then you had Anne la lui veut donner, which is ungrammatical now. If you did not apply it, you get Anne veut la lui donner. And that is exactly what you find in Italian. So Italian has stayed at the stage of 17th century French. In Italian, you have Anna gliela vuol dare. Anna wants to give, gliela to him or her, it. But also you can have in Italian, here. Anna vuole dargliela, the second, the B sentence. Anna wants to give her or him it. in Italian, clitics united with infinitives and participles are attached as suffix by an extra post-cyclic rule, which is not relevant here. So in Italian, you have two forms for saying the same. Anna gliela vuole dare, and Anna vuole dargliela. Same here in French. Conrad semble l'avoir trouvé. Conrad seems to have found it. Ungrammatical, Conrad le semble avoir trouvé. In Italian, Corrado sembra averlo trovato. Perfect. With the lo attached to the lower /s, to the lower VP, and then becomes a suffix to avere. But you can also have Corrado lo sembra aver trovato. Conrad seems to have found. They mean exactly the same. The difference is of a very superficial kind, stylistic, if you like. I have consulted a number of really good Italian native speakers, and they've assured me that they have the same status and that any choice is between the two is determined by considerations of sentence rhythm, or very superficial, but the grammar allows for both. So this is, I'll take one more detail of English where you can see how the system works for the sentences. John wants to eat the cake, where you have where want, you see that in English the verb want induces either subject deletion or subject raising, depending on the structure of the sentence. All that is specified in the lexicon. Want takes subject deletion when the lower subject is referential, identical to the higher subject. Then you delete the lower subject, you get a /s here, and John wants to eat the cake. But if SD cannot be applied because the lower subject is different, as in John wants Lucy to eat the cake, there is no subject deletion. And then you have subject raising. John want John Lucy, embedded S, /s, to eat the cake. And that explains fully why in English you say, I want to eat the cake, or I want you to eat the cake. This is an automatic product of the grammar. Now I can go on, but my time is up. To summarize, I think we can conclude that semantic syntax does, to the extent that it has been developed already, does do a magnificent job. I'm not President Trump, who continuously praises himself, but I praise myself on this. I claim that semantic syntax is superior, empirically superior to the Chomsky model in all sorts of ways. What I've given you is a mere glimpse, but I have done much more work in it, and others hopefully will follow me because I can't do it all alone. And it is already clear that the processes described in even this little fragment of the grammar that I've shown to you are found in languages, remote languages all over the world. In Australia, in New Guinea, in South America, in North America, in Eskimo land. Everywhere in the world, you find the same phenomena that can be treated analogously as long as you set the parameters of variation in a proper way in your general theory and in the lexicon, which provides for a lot of possible parameter setting. When you do that, you get a much more unified picture of all the languages in the world. And that will be an important step forward towards an overall theory of language, which can be adapted as you go along and as you may hit upon empirical problems, but which can be amplified, enriched, and enriched as you treat more and more so-called indigenous languages. That process is now going on, and I think it looks very promising. So this, I hope, gives you a taste of the explanatory power and the solid theoretical foundation of the semantic syntax system as a whole. I think even to the extent that it has been developed so far, it poses a massive challenge to any possible alternative theory of grammar. It also establishes a link with all adjacent disciplines, with neurolinguistics, with cognitive linguistics, with psycholinguistics, with sociolinguistics, etc. So it opens the perspective of finally a linguistic theory that unifies all and takes an organic place amongst all the adjacent disciplines and takes away the dispersion and the confusion that at the moment dominates the linguistic departments in the world's universities. It also will make linguistics a respectable science again, status which unfortunately it has lost over the past decades. That's about it. I end up with saying thank you, obrigado, gracias, efharisto, grazie, and merci to all of you. As a final thing, if you want the full text of this paper, because it has been a tiresome and difficult paper to follow, I know that, please note my email address. Just send me an email and I'll send you a PDF file of the whole text with all the structures and all the details that you need, so you can have a look at it again. Peter, with I, peter.seuren at MPI, Max Planck Institute, mpi.nl. Again, thank you very much.
Thank you, Peter. It was very nice to follow a presentation of yours again after a few years when I was your student. There were a few questions. I got a question, but I think this one goes pretty much hand in hand with a question that was posed on the chat. Question number one is, in which ways does semantic syntax diverge from the original program sketched by Macaulay and others? And how does semantic syntax address the criticisms Chomsky, Jackendorf, and others voiced against generative semantics? For instance, doesn't semantic syntax rely too heavily on excessively powerful destructive operations?
On extremely powerful what?
Destructive operations. That was a question by Giuseppe Varaskin.
Destructive, I haven't got the word.
Operations. Destructive operations.
Operation?
Yes.
Destructive operations?
Yes.
Why destructive?
Excessively powerful operations.
Oh, powerful. Oh,
Yeah.
I see. Well, that's a lot of questions. The first is, how much of Macaulay's original ideas are still here? Well, how many of those original ideas are still there? Well, all of them. I have taken over all of Macaulay's original ideas, but I have added a lot more technicalities, which Macaulay never did. But Macaulay is really the first origin of this way of doing grammar, but he himself did not develop the grammar to any detail, and he was a little wild up to and uncontrolled. I have cut that out, but his main ideas I have maintained, even though he at the end dropped some of them since he had been deluded by the way things went in linguistics. But I consider all his ideas extremely powerful and valid. Some of them I developed on my own account, so and I still stick to those also. That was question number one. What was question number two?
Question number two was, how does semantic syntax address the criticisms Chomsky, Jackendorf,
right, okay,
voiced against generative semantics?
Well, Chomsky never had a serious criticism. Chomsky's reaction to what was then called generative semantics, which I call semantic syntax, Chomsky's reaction was one of grim silence. There was no reaction. The only way he criticized semantic syntax or generative semantics was by holding up some licentious fantasies produced by over-enthusiastic followers who were not good scientists and applied generative semantics in uncontrolled ways, which were very easy to destroy. And that's what Chomsky did. He went for the weakest and least controlled manifestations of generative semantics, but he never ever addressed the real thesis of generative semantics, or he misrepresented them. In the literature of the 70s and the 80s, you see Chomskyans listing the main theses of generative semantics in completely incorrect ways, which of course were easy to beat down. But the real substance of the thing, namely that for all sorts of theoretical and empirical reasons, you have to take the semantic analysis as input, that was never addressed. A rather painful aspect of this is that my analysis of the French faire construction, which goes back to those years, I wrote a paper in 1972 exactly detailing the things that I've shown to you now. So it's actually quite old. It's almost 50 years old. There was never any reaction from Chomskyans, even though I quoted Chomskyan authors who had dealt with the construction, with the same construction, but in incorrect ways. And in my paper of 1972 called Predicate Raising and Dative in French and Sundry Languages, I point out why those treatments are incorrect, where they fail. Not a syllable in the way of an answer, just closed lips, don't react. I noticed, I tried with a couple of journals in those days to have my paper published. It was refused without comment. Also, I sent my paper to all the people concerned. All notable linguists of the day knew about that paper. No reaction. Why? My only answer is they didn't have a reply. There was no argument against it. But by openly admitting that, they would have to admit the failure of their grammatical model. And that is one of the reasons I found that extremely painful. I had the idea that some sort of fatwa had been pronounced on my work. In fact, I heard from people at MIT during the past decades that that was indeed the fact, that was indeed so. And I found that very painful. And that is why I insist on it still now, even after 50 years, those arguments are fully valid. And that analysis was the right analysis. And anyone who looks at it with impartial eyes will see that it has a lot of conviction to it. And if you have arguments against it, of course you're welcome. Of course I will reply, but they have to be reasonable arguments. Jackendorf never addressed generative semantics as such, nor did Chomsky, as I said, but Jackendorf never did that. Not as such, but he proposed an alternative analysis, which I reject. And I replied to that in a short critical comment in the periodical Language of several years ago, where Jackendorf had published an article and I wrote a reply to that, and he replied to that again. And since then we have agreed to disagree. But the Jackendorf part of it is not nearly as painful, or I may say scandalous, as the Chomsky part of it. Has that answered your question?
Yes, thank you, Peter. I'm sure they will send you emails anyway. There are another few questions. Let me read another one for you. This is by Luana de Conto. I am puzzled, she says, by the cognitive logic that Professor Seuren mentioned in the beginning of his talk. Could he enlighten us on this subject?
Not now. That would take a whole course. But whoever is interested in that side of things only has to send me an email. I have another paper which I finished a couple of months ago, a PDF paper, which I can send immediately. And that takes up that topic in great detail, in formal detail. And I think it's one of the best papers I've ever written. And I will be very happy to send that to anyone who is interested in this aspect.
Then,
I know this doesn't answer the question, but it shows the way towards an answer.
There is another question by Delanges Daler. It reads, in minimalist theory, also Chomsky said that we have a mapping between syntax and semantics. Could semantic syntax be like minimalist theory in that issue?
Could you repeat that? The last sentence?
Could semantic syntax be like the minimalist program in that issue?
No, there is a fundamental difference, because minimalism is a random sentence generator. And that is something that I totally reject. I think that a serious linguist should take a realist cognitive point of view and try to reconstruct what happens in the mind. We have now reached the stage, fortunately, where we can do away with the horror mentis that plagued all the human sciences throughout the 20th century. We have left that behind us now, and we recognize the causal power of the mind as such. Given that, I think we have no other choice but to accept that the grammar is a transformational system with the semantic analysis as input and a phonetic form as output. And that is the coupling between meaning and form that we achieve in the theory of grammar, and not through an arbitrary start button. As I said, that is cognitively absurd and formally unnecessarily complex, to put it mildly. So there really is a rift, an unbridgeable rift between semantic syntax and the Chomsky model, minimalism, or whatever you like to call it. And there is no way to reconcile the one with the other. I think it's only honest to recognize that. What we can do, possibly, but that requires a detailed look at specific analyses. We may use analysis from the Chomsky camp, from the Chomsky generative grammar camp. Specific analyses may enlighten problems that are dealt with in the spirit of semantic syntax, and vice versa. They are welcome to use our analyses, my analyses, or those of others, and see what they can do with it. But in practice, this doesn't happen. The Chomskyans, do not even look at what we do or produce. And so far, the things I have seen done in the camp of the Chomskyan grammarians have proved of surprisingly little inspirational power to me or to the few people that are working with me. But in principle, there should be a meeting of minds, in the sense that we look at each other's analyses and maybe get inspired by each other's analyses and make use of them. And that will help solve the ultimate question, which of the two is right? But as theories, they cannot be combined. They are totally different.
Thank you, Peter. Then there is another question by Alvaro Chang. The question reads, Wernicke's aphasia can present in different degrees of severity and symptoms, but in general terms, how could semantic syntax help us understand the semantic impairment typical of this condition?
Yes, that's a very interesting question. It's also a valid question, and it's also a premature question. But it certainly is something to be looked at in combination, to be looked at by both us kind of people, by both semantic syntactic grammarians on the one hand and neurolinguists on the other. But we haven't got to the point where this is realizable. I am part of an institute, the Max Planck Institute of Psycholinguistics in Nijmegen, where that sort of investigation is being carried out. But I'm getting an old man, I'm 86 at the moment, and it's difficult to break into running research projects. But in principle, it is something that could and perhaps should be looked at the institute or other institutes where similar research is carried out. So it's a very good question, and the answer is true, but premature maybe. Maybe, hopefully, in the coming few years, this sort of thing will be taken up. We have one student here, a PhD student, who is working on that already. But he does feel a bit uncertain because none of his supervisors is familiar enough with semantic syntax to see how it works. But you have to give those things time. Thank you.
Thank you, Peter. Then
Next question.
Next question, yes, by Giuseppe Varaskin again. The question is, why, let me read, why is the semantic syntax model algorithmic as opposed to constraint-based like HPSG, lexical, functional grammar, etc.?
Oh gosh, yes.
Isn't this a residue of the proof-theoretic foundation of Chomsky's early work we should now abandon?
Yes. Well, first of all, I may compliment all those people who are asking the questions because they're all very good questions. In this particular question is
Peter, sorry, could you please move that? Yes, thank you. Yeah.
So, can you hear me better now?
Perfect. Yes.
Yes, I'm not used to these appliances, and
yes,
they slip down from my ears. But can you hear me now?
Perfect. Yes. Thank you.
Okay. So I said I compliment all those who came with questions. They're all very good questions. Obviously, I cannot go down all the other theories of grammar that have seen the light over the past decades, lexical functional grammar, HPSG in particular, all of which are extremely intelligently devised and capture part of linguistic reality. What I can say is that my semantic syntax system has or embodies, incorporates many features of lexical functional grammar. So it would certainly be worthwhile to have a good comparative look at both and see where they differ and how they differ and why they differ. The same goes, but to a lesser extent, for HPSG, which I have always appreciated as something that that I found extremely intelligent and well thought out and well worth looking at. But unfortunately, I have no time left to do that in detail myself. I hope somebody will take that up and look at it. Maybe useful features are to be found in HPSG that can be used in semantic syntax. I'm not aware of any recent developments in HPSG, but if there are any, then they might look at semantic syntax and see how they can use it for their purposes.
Thank you.
Have I answered the question, or is there a remaining aspect that I have forgotten about?
There is a remaining aspect of the question that reads, let me say, as regarding the fact that semantic syntax is an algorithmic model, isn't this a residue of the proof-theoretic foundation of Chomsky's early work we should now abandon?
Yes, I realized there was one aspect I had forgotten, and it was this one. I don't think, to begin with proof theory, I don't think that proof theory has any function in grammar. I think that is an important element of logical theory, but not of grammatical theory. But what is important to emphasize with regard to semantic syntax is that, of course, semantic syntax is not called semantic syntax for nothing. It is called semantic syntax because it has a semantic input, and its output is semantically loaded. But the actual machinery of the grammar is purely algorithmic, purely formal. It just carries out instructions, formal instructions. It's like a production line, a production plant in a factory. You put something in and the rest is closed. The machine does its work and it spews out an output. And you do with the output as you like. And like a good engineer, the human mind is a good engineer. The human mind finds shortcuts in the production line so that it finds, maybe on statistical grounds, that it is useful to keep certain combinations in reserve so they can be plugged in at the right moment at the right place and don't have to be processed anymore. I think that does happen very much in actual production. It happens a great deal in comprehension. And that is why people tend to repeat phrases, not just words, but phrases in a dialogue. Somebody has concocted a phrase and it's taken over by the listener who uses it in his reply to the speaker reuses it, and so it becomes fossilized. Those are processes of actual communication that may acquire sociolinguistic value, that may lead to regrammaticalization, etc. One has to reckon with all those possibilities. Is that germane to the question, or is it not?
It is. Thank you. Thank you, Peter. Just as a final question from my side, what future avenues do you think are promising in bridging the findings of semantic syntax or the theory of semantic syntax and subfields like historical linguistics and language contact studies?
Yes. Again, thank you, Luis Miguel. It's a very good question. I have, as you know, close contact with a historical linguist here at the Institute, and she finds it very useful. When we go through, she works on the history of the Romance languages all the way back to Indo-European, and she finds it very useful to see how a synchronic analysis of features, not only in French, but also in other languages, are found again in ancient structures, and how you see variation turning up in different sociological strata of ancient societies, to the extent that we have data about that. And this takes me to sociolinguistics. I think it is extremely useful to use semantic syntax for sociolinguistic analyses. You see that choices, sociolinguistic selections, choices that are made between alternative possible linguistic forms marked for different sociolinguistic or communicative purposes, formal, informal, etc. They differ very often. They differ according to the parameters set out by semantic syntax. And that, I think, is a very fruitful development. The same with typological linguistics, typology. You see that languages in isolated communities all over the world differ according to parameters set out in the theory of semantic syntax. In fact, you and I have discovered predicate raising in so many out-of-the-way languages already that this hardly needs stressing. Does that answer your question?
Yes, Peter, thank you very much. So on behalf of the Brazilian Association of Linguistics, I thank you wholeheartedly. From Australia, we are on a three-way online
I thank you too, and I thank the organizer, Luis Oliveira, from
Miguel.
From Maceió in Alagoas, for the initiative taken. I think I must say well done, and I think it's a very useful initiative, and thanks for the opportunity. It was a pleasure to do so. And don't forget, do take my email down, which I'll show again. Okay. peter.seuren@mpi.nl, and I'll send any paper you want me to send. Thank you very much. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Thank you. Bye-bye. Thank you.